The trebuchet arms swung through the cold Crimean air in 1347, but instead of launching rocks at the besieged walls of Kaffa, it hurled something far deadlier: human corpses. The Mongol army under Jani Beg had been decimated by a mysterious disease that turned men's skin black and filled their lymph nodes with pus until they burst. In desperation and rage, the Khan ordered his engineers to catapult the plague-ridden bodies of his own dead soldiers over the fortified walls of the Genoese trading port. The defenders watched in horror as decomposing corpses rained down into their city streets, contaminating wells and spreading panic. Within days, the same black boils that had killed the Mongol warriors began appearing on the necks and groins of Kaffa's residents. Terrified Genoese merchants abandoned the city, cramming onto 12 galleys and fleeing toward what they thought would be safety in Sicily. They were wrong. Those ships would become floating coffins, carrying death itself across the Mediterranean Sea and unleashing the most catastrophic pandemic in human history. When the death ships arrived at the Sicilian port of Messina in October 1347, the crowd gathered at the docks expecting to see traders with exotic goods from the east. Instead, they discovered a nightmare. Most of the sailors lay dead on the decks, their bodies covered in strange black swellings the size of apples. Those still alive were barely conscious, vomiting blood, and covered in dark patches where their skin had begun to rot. The stench of death hung so thick in the air that people gagged from 50 feet away. Sicilian authorities immediately ordered the fleet out of the harbor, but it was already too late. The invisible killer had already leaped from the ships to the shore. Within weeks, bodies were piling up in Messina's streets faster than they could be buried. Families tried to flee, spreading the contagion to every corner of the island. The plague moved with terrifying speed, as if it had wings, jumping from city to city, person to person, killing with ruthless efficiency. By January 1348, the disease had reached Genoa and Venice, entering through their bustling ports where ships from across the known world docked daily. In Pisa, the outbreak exploded with such violence that the city's chroniclers could barely keep up with the death toll. One merchant described streets so choked with corpses that horses couldn't pass. The sick were abandoned by their own families, left to die alone in locked rooms while their relatives fled. Priests refused to administer last rites, and gravediggers demanded enormous sums to handle the infected dead, those who could even be found alive to do the work. From Italy, the Black Death radiated outward like a malevolent star. It struck France, Spain, and Portugal by June 1348, with Marseille becoming a charnel house as the disease swept through the Mediterranean port. England fell next, the plague landing at Melcombe Regis in Dorset in August 1348, before racing across the countryside with supernatural speed. The symptoms were unlike anything medieval physicians had ever encountered. It started with sudden, violent fever and chills that made victims shake uncontrollably. Then came the buboes, grotesque swellings in the groin, armpits, and neck that grew to the size of eggs or even larger. These black, blood-filled lumps would eventually burst, releasing streams of pus and blood that stank of rotting meat. The Italian poet Giovanni Boccaccio documented the horror in precise detail. The swellings would appear, grow rapidly, then the victim would begin vomiting and bleeding from every orifice. Dark patches spread across the skin as tissue died and turned black, hence the name that would terrify Europe for centuries. Some victims coughed up blood in violent fits, spreading a pneumonic form of the plague through the air itself. Most people died within 3 to 5 days of the first symptoms appearing. The mortality rate was staggering. Approximately 80% of those infected perished. What made the Black Death uniquely terrifying was its seeming randomness. It killed the pious and the sinful, the rich and the poor, the young and the old. King Alfonso XI of Castile died of the plague, as did Joan of England, daughter of King Edward III, while traveling to her wedding. The Byzantine emperor lost his son. Simeon of Moscow and the head of the Russian Church both fell to the disease. But plague also devastated peasants in their hovels and merchants in their counting houses with equal ferocity. No amount of prayer, no medical treatment, no wealth or status could protect you. Giovanni Boccaccio wrote that the mere touching of the clothes appeared to itself to communicate the malady to the toucher. People watched their loved ones transform from healthy to dead in less than a week, sometimes in just days or even hours in the case of pneumonic plague. If you're as fascinated by this dark chapter of human history as we are, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into history's most shocking events. Drop a like if this story is gripping you, and tell us in the comments, would you have stayed to help the sick or fled to save yourself? Your engagement helps us bring more untold stories to light. The death toll mounted with incomprehensible speed. Between 1347 and 1352, Europe lost somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of its entire population. Conservative estimates put the number at 25 million dead, but some historians believe the true figure approached 50 million when accounting for deaths in Asia and the Middle East. In some regions, the devastation was even more complete. The Italian city-states were hit particularly hard. Florence lost half its population, with bodies stacked like cordwood in mass graves. Paris saw such mountains of corpses that the city ran out of consecrated ground to bury them, forcing officials to dig enormous pits in fields outside the walls, where thousands of bodies were dumped in layers, barely covered with dirt. The speed of the demographic collapse was unprecedented in human history. Villages that had stood for centuries were abandoned overnight, their populations either dead or fled. Fields of grain rotted unharvested, as there was no one left alive to bring in the crops. Entire family lines were extinguished in weeks. A chronicler in England noted that in some parishes, 9 out of 10 people died. Cattle and sheep wandered freely through abandoned towns, and wolves, growing bold from the absence of humans, began entering cities to feed on corpses left in the streets. The social fabric of medieval Europe literally disintegrated as the plague's shadow fell across the continent. By 1349, the Black Death had crossed the English Channel and was ravaging London. The city suffered most violently between February and May of that year, with contemporary accounts describing carts making constant rounds to collect the dead. The disease then spread to East Anglia and Yorkshire during the summer, moving north with relentless determination. Scotland and Scandinavia fell in 1350, and by 1352, the plague had reached the remote corners of Russia, finally arriving in Moscow in 1353. Some isolated regions escaped the worst: parts of the Basque Country, isolated alpine villages, and certain areas of Belgium and the Netherlands saw fewer deaths, likely due to their limited contact with major trade routes. The chroniclers of the age struggled to make sense of the catastrophe. Many left their records unfinished, trailing off mid-sentence as the writers themselves succumbed to the disease. One monk in England wrote, "I am leaving parchment for the work to continue, if, by chance, anyone from the race of Adam should escape this pestilence and wish to continue the work I have begun." He never wrote another word. Church records show that parishes lost their priests so rapidly that there was no one left to record deaths or perform funeral rites. In the Diocese of Coventry and Lichfield, records indicate massive mortality among the clergy, who were exposed to the sick through their pastoral duties of visiting and comforting the dying. The Black Death showed no signs of slowing as it carved its path across the known world. From Europe, it spread into North Africa, devastating Cairo and other cities along the Mediterranean coast. The Middle East saw death on a similar scale to Europe, with estimates suggesting millions died in the plague's initial wave. The disease moved along the ancient trade routes of the Silk Road, striking Central Asia and reaching deep into China, India, and Persia. Some scholars estimate that Asia lost 25 million people in the 15 years before the plague even reached Constantinople in 1347, suggesting the pandemic had been ravaging the East while Europe remained blissfully unaware of the approaching doom. Yet, for all the death and documentation, a disturbing mystery remained at the heart of the Black Death. What exactly was it? For centuries, historians and scientists assumed the culprit was Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for bubonic plague. The symptoms seemed to match: the buboes, the fever, the rapid death. But troubling inconsistencies emerged when researchers examined the historical accounts more closely. The Black Death spread far too quickly to be explained by rat fleas alone, the traditional vector for bubonic plague. Eyewitnesses described the disease spreading through mere contact with clothing or through the air itself, which suggested a pneumonic form that could leap from person to person without needing rodent intermediaries. Even more puzzling, the earliest Chinese medical texts describing bubonic plague don't appear until the 1640s, nearly 300 years after the Black Death ravaged Europe. If the disease originated in Asia, as most scholars believed, why are there no earlier descriptions in Chinese medical literature? Some historians pointed out that contemporary accounts described a disease more virulent and contagious than any known form of Yersinia pestis. Medieval physicians wrote of people dying within hours of exposure, of whole households being wiped out overnight, of the disease traveling hundreds of miles in impossibly short timeframes. Modern bubonic plague, while deadly, doesn't behave this way. Even in its pneumonic form, it spreads more slowly than the Black Death appeared to move. The debate intensified in the late 20th century when some researchers began suggesting the Black Death might have been caused by a different pathogen entirely. Perhaps a hemorrhagic fever similar to Ebola, or even an unknown disease that has since evolved or disappeared. The symptom descriptions didn't quite match bubonic plague in all cases. Boccaccio and other chroniclers described victims bleeding from the nose and mouth, experiencing severe internal hemorrhaging, and dying with such speed that flea-borne transmission seemed impossible. One account from a French physician described the plague as a pestilential fever that killed as if by fire, suggesting something more aggressive than slow-moving bubonic plague. The mystery appeared to be solved in the late 1990s and early 2000s, when scientists made a breakthrough. Using cutting-edge genetic techniques, researchers extracted bacterial DNA from the teeth of plague victims buried in medieval mass graves across Europe. The results were dramatic. They found genetic signatures of Yersinia pestis in burial sites in France, England, Germany, and Italy. The bacterium was definitely present in plague victims. Even more remarkably, genetic analysis showed that the medieval strain of Y. pestis was ancestral to all modern plague strains. Every case of bubonic plague in the world today descends directly from the Black Death pathogen. But finding Yersinia pestis in the victim's teeth didn't completely settle the debate. Some researchers argued that while the bacterium was present, it might not have been the only pathogen involved, or the medieval strain might have been far more virulent than modern versions. The genetic evidence proved that Y. pestis was part of the Black Death, but questions remained about whether it fully explained the pandemic's unprecedented speed and lethality. Recent studies have suggested that the plague likely spread through multiple transmission routes simultaneously. Flea bites caused bubonic plague, which could then develop into septicemic plague in the bloodstream, or pneumonic plague in the lungs, which could spread person to person through respiratory droplets. This multi-route transmission theory helps explain the Black Death's terrifying speed. While rats and fleas carried the disease along trade routes and into cities, once it arrived, it could spread directly between humans through coughing and close contact. This would account for the rapid inland spread that seemed too fast for rat-based transmission alone. Additionally, human body lice have recently been identified as potential vectors, which would explain how the plague could race through crowded medieval cities where people lived in close quarters with poor hygiene. The disease likely exploited every available transmission route, making it far more efficient than modern plague outbreaks that rely primarily on flea bites. Adding another layer to the mystery, recent research has revealed that the Black Death wasn't a single introduction of plague into Europe, but rather repeated waves of reintroduction from Asia over 4 centuries. Scientists studying tree ring data and climate records from Central Asia discovered something remarkable. Climate fluctuations in Asian rodent plague reservoirs directly correlated with new plague outbreaks in Europe, with a consistent lag time of about 15 years. When weather patterns in Central Asia created conditions favorable for rodent population explosions, plague would flourish in these wild colonies. 15 years later, the disease would appear in European ports, having traveled along the maritime trade networks. This climate-driven model revolutionized understanding of how plague persisted in Europe for so long. Historians had long assumed that after the initial Black Death outbreak, the disease established itself in European rodent populations and caused periodic outbreaks from local reservoirs. But the evidence now suggests something different. Europe was being repeatedly reinfected from Asia. The plague didn't truly establish permanent residence in European wildlife. Instead, it kept arriving in waves from the east, triggered by climate patterns that modern scientists can now track in annual tree ring records and historical climate proxies. Each time conditions in Central Asian rodent colonies became favorable for plague, a new wave would begin its journey westward. This explains one of the great puzzles of plague history. Why did outbreaks occur in such regular cycles? The disease would rage through Europe, disappear for a decade or more, then suddenly return with renewed fury. These weren't local flare-ups from European rat populations, but fresh introductions from Asian plague reservoirs. The 10 to 15-year cycle matches almost perfectly with the lag time between climate-driven outbreaks in Asia and their arrival in European ports. The 16th and 17th centuries saw 2 to 3 times as many plague epidemics as earlier periods, possibly because climate instability during the Little Ice Age created more frequent, favorable conditions for rodent plague outbreaks in Central Asia. Archaeological evidence supports this climate-driven reintroduction model. Mass graves from different plague outbreaks across Europe have been excavated and studied in recent decades, revealing the true horror of the pandemic's physical impact. At burial sites in London, Paris, and other major cities, archaeologists have found bodies stacked in layers, sometimes 10 or 15 deep in hastily dug pits. Many skeletons show clear signs of hemorrhagic damage to lymph nodes, particularly in the groin and neck areas where buboes formed. The bones of some victims display evidence of septicemic plague, with blackened necrotic tissue still preserved in the soil around their remains after 6 centuries. One particularly haunting discovery came from excavations at plague burial sites in Martigues, France. Researchers found that the arrangement of bodies in mass graves told a story of evolving crisis management. Early in an outbreak, bodies were laid out carefully, with some attempt at individual burial. As deaths mounted, bodies were simply tossed into pits with less and less ceremony. In the final stages, when the death toll overwhelmed all social norms, corpses were stacked haphazardly, sometimes incompletely covered with soil. Some mass graves remained unfinished, presumably because the gravediggers themselves died before completing their grim work. DNA analysis of bones from these burial sites has provided unprecedented insights into the plague's behavior and spread. By comparing genetic signatures of Y. pestis from different times and places, scientists can now track how the disease moved across continents and evolved over time. They've discovered that the Black Death strain was remarkably stable genetically, showing that the same basic pathogen caused outbreaks across centuries. More intriguingly, analysis of family burial groups revealed a striking pattern. If a mother's remains showed signs of plague, but her bones indicated she survived the initial infection, her children's remains showed similar survival patterns. If the mother died, the children almost invariably died as well. This suggests that maternal care, and perhaps maternal immunity, played crucial roles in child survival during plague outbreaks. Human remains from plague burials have also shed light on the social dimensions of the catastrophe. Contrary to popular imagination of plague as primarily a disease of the poor, skeletal analysis shows that all social classes were affected. Wealthy individuals, identified by expensive grave goods or burial locations, died of plague alongside paupers. However, there's evidence that the rich learned to protect themselves as the pandemic progressed. Later plague outbreaks show more stratified mortality, with wealthier neighborhoods experiencing lower death rates than poor areas. The rich could afford to flee cities when plague struck, could barricade themselves in country estates, and had better nutrition to support their immune systems. The physical evidence from medieval plague sites is often gruesome beyond imagination. Some skeletons display evidence of buboes that ruptured with such force that they caused permanent damage to surrounding bone tissue. Others show signs of septicemic plague, where the infection spread throughout the bloodstream, causing systemic organ failure and the characteristic black discoloration of extremities that gave the disease its terrifying name. The Black Death moniker, while popularized centuries later, was horrifyingly accurate. Victims' fingers, toes, noses, and ears would turn black as tissue died from lack of blood flow, giving corpses a distinctive and nightmarish appearance. Archaeological evidence has also revealed the desperate measures people took to protect themselves. In some plague pits, bodies were found covered in quicklime, which medieval people believed would neutralize the disease. Others were buried with religious amulets, coins placed over the eyes, or in positions suggesting elaborate purification rituals. These grave goods tell a story of a society grasping at any possible protection against an enemy they couldn't understand. Some victims were buried face down, possibly because they died so suddenly that rigor mortis set in before anyone could turn them over, or because survivors feared the dead might rise again, a common superstition during plague years. The mass graves themselves reveal the overwhelming scale of death. In London, excavations for the Crossrail project in the 2000s uncovered a burial ground at Charterhouse Square containing thousands of plague victims from 1348 to 1349. The site yielded 25 virtually complete skeletons and thousands of bone fragments from at least 13,000 individuals. DNA testing confirmed Y. pestis in the remains. Similar mass graves have been found across Europe, in Toulouse, France, Barcelona, Spain, and numerous German cities. Each tells the same story: death on a scale that completely overwhelmed normal burial practices, forcing communities to resort to mass internment in hastily consecrated ground. Perhaps most chilling are the unfinished graves and incomplete burial sites. In several locations, archaeologists have found plague pits where bodies were partially buried but never fully covered with earth, suggesting that the gravediggers died or fled before finishing their work. These sites offer a frozen moment of absolute social breakdown, when even the basic human ritual of burying the dead became impossible to complete. The bodies simply lay where they fell, too numerous and too dangerous for the dwindling population of survivors to handle. Scavengers and weather scattered the bones, creating chaotic deposits of human remains that archaeologists centuries later would struggle to interpret. The social and psychological impact of the Black Death was as devastating as its physical toll. Medieval society wasn't prepared for random, unavoidable death on such a massive scale. The plague attacked the fundamental assumptions that structured medieval life: that God rewarded the righteous and punished the wicked, that social hierarchy reflected divine order, that the future would resemble the past. When plague struck without regard for virtue or social station, when prayers proved as useless as physicians, when tomorrow might never come, the entire medieval worldview collapsed. People responded in wildly different ways, creating a period of social upheaval and cultural chaos unlike anything Europe had experienced since the fall of Rome. Giovanni Boccaccio, writing from Florence during the plague years, documented the breakdown of social order with a novelist's eye for detail. He described neighbors abandoning neighbors, children fleeing from dying parents, husbands deserting sick wives. "Many died daily or nightly in the public streets," he wrote. "And many others, though dying in their homes, made it known to neighbors that they were dead more by the stench of their rotting bodies than by any other means." The normal bonds of family, friendship, and community dissolved in the face of terror. Funeral rites, central to medieval Catholic culture, became perfunctory or stopped altogether. Bodies were dumped unceremoniously in pits without priests, prayers, or ceremony. The dead were treated with less respect than garbage. But more shocking than the abandonment of the dead was the abandonment of the living. Boccaccio described people fleeing from anyone who showed the slightest sign of illness, leaving them to die alone, without food, water, or comfort. Parents abandoned sick children. Children fled from dying parents. Servants ran away from their masters. In the face of a disease that killed through contact, even the most basic human compassion became a potentially fatal act. The sick were locked in their homes and left to die, with the doors sometimes barred from outside to prevent them from spreading infection. Whole families were sealed inside plague houses, with guards posted to ensure no one escaped, creating small tombs where everyone inside was condemned to death. Work ceased across entire regions as people either died, fell sick, or fled in terror. Fields of wheat and barley stood unharvested, rotting in the rain as there was no one to bring in the crops. Workshops closed as artisans died or abandoned their trades. Markets emptied. Ships sat idle in harbors because sailors refused to board vessels that might be infected. The economic machinery that sustained medieval life ground to a halt. In the short term, this created severe food shortages and price spikes. Those goods that could still be produced or imported commanded astronomical prices because the risk of obtaining them was so high. Economic activity contracted sharply, with some estimates suggesting GDP dropped by a third or more in the immediate plague years. Faced with this apocalyptic breakdown, people responded in dramatically different ways, creating what Boccaccio described as two opposite extremes of behavior. One group believed that the plague was God's punishment for sin and responded with extreme religious devotion. They isolated themselves, prayed constantly, fasted, and avoided all contact with the outside world. They believed that through piety and self-denial, they might earn God's protection. The other extreme adopted what might be called an apocalyptic hedonism, captured in the maxim, "Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we may die." These people threw themselves into revelry, spending their days in taverns, gorging on food and wine, engaging in every pleasure they could find while they still lived. The medieval world was literally drinking itself to death while corpses piled in the streets. If you're captivated by these dark tales of human nature under extreme pressure, smash that subscribe button and drop a like. Comment below. Which group would you have joined? The penitent prayers or the apocalyptic partygoers? Your support keeps these stories coming. Boccaccio himself took a middle path, retreating with a small group to a villa outside Florence, where they entertained themselves by telling stories, the tales that became the Decameron. But for many, moderation was impossible in the face of certain death. Contemporary accounts describe cities where normal social order completely collapsed. People wandered the streets drunk at all hours. Sexual morality evaporated as men and women seized whatever pleasures they could before death found them. Gambling, dancing, music, and feasting continued even as funeral processions passed by. It was a society-wide existential crisis, with people literally partying while Rome burned. This breakdown of social norms resembled the controlled chaos of Carnival, but without any controls or end date. Carnival was traditionally a brief period of sanctioned disorder before Lent, when social hierarchies inverted and normal rules were suspended. The plague years felt like an endless carnival, a permanent state of exception where nothing was forbidden because there might be no tomorrow. Servants spoke back to masters. Women abandoned traditional modesty. Young people defied their elders. Authority at every level, parental, ecclesiastical, governmental, weakened as the institutions that enforced it lost members and credibility. Why obey rules when the rule makers were dying in the streets? The psychological toll was immense. Imagine watching your neighbors die one by one, never knowing if you would be next. Every sneeze, every headache, every moment of fatigue became a potential death sentence. People lived in constant terror, jumping at shadows, avoiding all human contact, seeing death everywhere they looked. Some went mad from the stress. Others fell into catatonic depression, simply giving up and waiting for death to claim them. The chroniclers describe people who seemed to will themselves to die, losing all hope and purpose. In a world where the plague showed no signs of ending, where half the population had already died, where tomorrow was anything but certain, despair became a rational response. Into this chaos stepped some of the most extreme religious movements medieval Europe had ever seen. The Flagellants emerged as a response to the plague, forming processions of penitents who wandered from town to town, publicly whipping themselves bloody in atonement for humanity's sins. They believed the Black Death was divine punishment, and that through extreme self-mortification, they could appease God's wrath and end the plague. These processions were theatrical and horrifying in equal measure. Men would strip to the waist and whip themselves with leather scourges studded with metal points, drawing blood and tearing flesh while chanting prayers and hymns. The flagellant movement spread rapidly across Germany, the Low Countries, and parts of France. The Flagellants represented a direct challenge to church authority. They claimed that their suffering and penance was more powerful than the sacraments administered by priests. They performed their own quasi-religious rituals, heard each other's confessions, and granted absolution, functions that Catholic doctrine reserved exclusively for ordained clergy. As the movement grew, it became increasingly radical and anti-clerical. Flagellant preachers denounced the corruption of the church and claimed that priests and bishops were useless against the plague. When so many clergy had died and prayers had failed to stop the disease, these arguments found receptive audiences. The church initially tolerated the Flagellants, seeing them as misguided but pious. However, as the movement grew more radical and began challenging ecclesiastical authority, Pope Clement VI condemned flagellantism in 1349, ordering the arrest of flagellant leaders. But the damage to church credibility was already done. The plague had exposed the impotence of religious institutions. Priests and bishops died at rates equal to or higher than the general population because their pastoral duties put them in close contact with the sick and dying. Many parishes lost their priests entirely. Monasteries that had housed dozens of monks were reduced to a handful of survivors. The clergy who remained often refused to administer last rites or visit the sick, fearing for their own lives. This failure of the Church to protect its flock, or even explain the catastrophe, created a crisis of faith across Europe. People who had lived their entire lives according to church teachings, who had prayed daily, attended Mass, and followed religious law, died just as quickly as notorious sinners. The pious and the profane fell together into mass graves. If God was punishing sin, why did the plague kill indiscriminately? If prayers and sacraments had power, why did they fail? These questions undermined centuries of religious authority and planted seeds of doubt that would eventually flower into the Protestant Reformation. The plague years saw an intensification of apocalyptic belief across Europe. Many people became convinced they were living in the end times, that the Black Death was one of the plagues prophesied in the Book of Revelation. Preachers announced that the Antichrist would soon appear, that the Last Judgment was at hand. This apocalyptic mentality manifested in extreme behaviors and new religious movements. Some formed communes where they held all property in common and waited for Christ's return. Others engaged in frenzied religious ecstasy, claiming direct communication with God or the saints. The boundary between orthodox faith and heresy became increasingly blurred as traditional religious structures crumbled. The crisis of faith also manifested in darker ways. As European populations sought explanations for the inexplicable catastrophe destroying their world, they turned to conspiracy theories and scapegoating. The Jews became the primary target of this displaced rage and fear. Anti-Semitic violence had existed in medieval Europe before the plague, but the Black Death triggered pogroms of unprecedented scale and brutality. Rumors spread that Jews had caused the plague by poisoning wells and rivers. The accusations were absurd. Jews were dying from plague at the same rates as Christians, but terrified populations needed someone to blame. The first major pogrom occurred in Toulon, France, in April 1348, where 40 Jews were murdered by a Christian mob. The violence spread rapidly. In Strasbourg, in February 1349, the Jewish community of 2,000 people was rounded up and burned alive in the Jewish cemetery. In Basel, the entire Jewish population was locked in wooden buildings and burned. In Mainz, Jews attempted to defend themselves but were overwhelmed. 6,000 died in a single day. Across the Germanic lands, the Low Countries, and parts of France and Spain, Jewish communities were attacked, burned, expelled, or massacred. Some authorities tried to protect their Jewish populations. Pope Clement VI issued papal bulls condemning the violence and pointing out that Jews were dying from plague just like Christians, proof they couldn't be causing it. Several kings and nobles attempted to shelter Jews, recognizing the accusations as baseless. But the violence continued, driven by a toxic combination of religious hatred, economic resentment — many Christians owed money to Jewish moneylenders — and the desperate need to blame someone for the catastrophe. In some cities, Christians forced Jews to confess under torture to poisoning wells, then used these coerced confessions to justify massacres. The Jewish pogroms during the Black Death years represent one of the darkest chapters in medieval European history. Entire communities that had existed for centuries were destroyed in days. Thousands of Jews fled eastward, particularly to Poland, where King Casimir III offered protection and relatively tolerant conditions. This eastward migration would reshape Jewish settlement patterns for centuries. The communities destroyed in the Rhineland, once centers of Jewish scholarship and culture, never fully recovered. The violence demonstrated how easily fear and crisis could unleash atavistic hatreds, how desperate people would believe any explanation rather than accept that they faced a random, impersonal killer that couldn't be controlled or understood. Beyond Jews, other marginalized groups faced persecution. Lepers were accused of spreading plague, as were beggars, foreigners, and anyone who seemed different or suspicious. In some places, women accused of witchcraft were burned, blamed for cursing communities with disease. The plague years saw a general breakdown of tolerance and a search for enemies, both real and imagined. This persecution provided psychological relief. If someone was causing the plague, then it wasn't random. It could be stopped by eliminating the guilty parties. But it did nothing to halt the disease's spread. The scapegoats died, and the plague continued its inexorable advance. The Black Death's timing made an already catastrophic situation even worse, as it coincided with one of Europe's most devastating conflicts, the 100 Years' War between England and France. This series of conflicts, which would ultimately last from 1337 to 1453, had already destabilized large parts of Western Europe when the plague arrived in 1347. The war had begun over English claims to the French throne and control of valuable French territories. Initial English victories at Crécy in 1346 had left France reeling. Then the plague arrived, and both kingdoms faced a dual catastrophe: war and pandemic simultaneously. The initial impact of the plague on the war was a brief cessation of major combat operations. Between 1347 and 1350, there was effectively a truce, not through any formal agreement, but because armies were literally dying where they stood. Soldiers succumbed to plague in camps and garrisons. Commanders died. Logistics collapsed as the workers who supplied armies with food, weapons, and equipment perished. It became impossible to maintain large field armies when half your soldiers might be dead within a month. Both England and France were forced to suspend serious campaigning simply because they couldn't field effective forces. But this plague-induced peace didn't last. When fighting resumed in 1355, it was even more devastating for civilian populations that had already been decimated by disease. Armies marching through plague-ravaged countryside found little to plunder or requisition. Soldiers, desperate for supplies, became more brutal in their treatment of civilians. Villages that had lost half their population to plague now faced raiding parties stripping them of what little remained. The combination of war and plague created a compound disaster that some regions never fully recovered from. The economic impact of fighting a major war during a pandemic was catastrophic. Both England and France had borrowed heavily to finance military operations, expecting to repay loans through taxation and plunder. But with half the tax-paying population dead, government revenues collapsed. Meanwhile, the costs of maintaining armies actually increased because soldiers could demand higher wages. If half the available soldiers were dead, survivors could charge premium rates for their dangerous services. Both kingdoms found themselves in severe financial crisis, unable to pay their debts or maintain their military forces. Military recruitment became nearly impossible in plague-affected regions. Who would volunteer to join an army when plague was already killing people in droves? Young men who might have seen military service as a path to glory or profit now had other options. Labor shortages meant they could demand high wages for farm work or skilled trades. Armies had to rely increasingly on mercenaries, who charged exorbitant rates. The quality of soldiers declined as professional warriors died and were replaced by whoever could be convinced or coerced to serve. This led to more undisciplined armies and increased brutality against civilians. The war exacerbated food shortages created by the plague. Armies requisitioned grain, leaving peasants to starve. Soldiers burned fields and destroyed crops as a matter of military strategy, practicing scorched earth tactics that left entire regions unable to feed themselves. When plague had already killed many farmers and left fields uncultivated, these military depredations pushed communities over the edge into famine. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making people more susceptible to disease. Plague and famine fed into each other in a vicious cycle, with war making both worse. Contemporary accounts describe scenes of unimaginable suffering in regions affected by both war and plague. The French chronicler Jean Froissart described abandoned villages where not a single living soul remained, killed by either plague or war. Wolves became so bold they entered towns to feed on corpses in the streets, and bands of starving survivors turned to banditry, preying on anyone weaker than themselves. The normal structures of law and order collapsed in many areas, replaced by a brutal struggle for survival, where the strong took what they needed from the weak. The compound crisis of war and plague had long-term consequences for both kingdoms. France, which had been devastated by English invasions and plague simultaneously, took decades to recover. Large parts of the kingdom were depopulated, with some regions losing up to 70% of their population to the combined effects of disease and conflict. This demographic catastrophe weakened French royal authority and strengthened regional lords who filled the power vacuum. England, though less physically devastated, suffered severe economic disruption and political instability that would eventually contribute to the Wars of the Roses in the following century. The plague also changed the nature of warfare itself. The demographic collapse made it impossible to raise the large feudal armies of earlier centuries. Military forces became smaller and more professional. The value of individual soldiers increased, leading to better pay and equipment for those who served. Naval warfare was particularly affected. Ships required large crews, but sailors were in short supply and could demand high wages. The English Navy, crucial for maintaining control over French coastal territories, struggled to find enough sailors willing to crew vessels during plague years. If these interconnected catastrophes of medieval history fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed to catch our next deep dive. Hit that like button if you're learning something new, and drop a comment. Could modern civilization survive a similar double catastrophe? Let's discuss below. Paradoxically, while war and plague together created immense suffering, the crisis also accelerated social and economic changes that might have taken centuries otherwise. The desperate need for soldiers, workers, and skills of all kinds broke down some traditional barriers and created opportunities for social advancement. But in the immediate term, the combination of the 100 Years' War and the Black Death created what some historians call a crisis of the late Middle Ages, a period of overlapping disasters that reshaped European society from the ground up. Yet amidst all this death and chaos, something unexpected began to emerge: the foundations of modern scientific thinking. Medieval physicians had entered the plague years armed with theories inherited from ancient Greek and Roman authorities, particularly Galen and Hippocrates. These theories attributed disease to imbalances in bodily humors, corrupted air, miasma, or unfavorable alignments of planets. Doctors prescribed treatments based on these ideas: bloodletting to balance humors, burning aromatic herbs to purify air, and consulting astrological charts to determine treatment timing. None of it worked. Patients died regardless of treatment, and doctors died alongside them. This complete failure of established medical doctrine forced a reckoning. Physicians who survived began questioning the ancient authorities they had been trained to revere. If Galen's theories were wrong about plague, what else might be wrong? Some doctors began keeping careful records of symptoms, progression, and outcomes, looking for patterns that might reveal the disease's true nature. They noticed that plague seemed to spread through contact with the sick or their belongings, not through corrupted air or star positions. The disease was contagious, passed from person to person through some mechanism they couldn't yet understand but could observe. This shift from theoretical to observational medicine was revolutionary. Medieval medical education had been based almost entirely on studying ancient texts and logical reasoning from first principles. Actual observation of patients was secondary to understanding the theoretical framework. The Black Death inverted this relationship. Theory had failed catastrophically, so doctors began trusting their own observations instead of ancient authorities. They performed autopsies on plague victims, documenting the physical damage the disease caused. They noted which treatments seemed to help, very few, and which made things worse, most of them. The concept of contagion, that diseases could spread from person to person through contact, emerged clearly from plague observations. While the germ theory of disease wouldn't be developed for another 5 centuries, medieval doctors during and after the plague understood that something could pass between people and cause illness. They didn't know what that something was, but they knew it existed. This led directly to the development of quarantine practices, one of the first effective public health measures in European history. The first formal quarantine was established at the Adriatic port of Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik, in 1377, just a generation after the Black Death's initial outbreak. Ships arriving from plague-affected regions were required to anchor offshore for 30 days, later extended to 40 days, from which we get the word quarantine from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days, before passengers and crew could land. If no one developed symptoms during this period, the ship was allowed to dock. If anyone became sick, the ship was turned away, or all aboard were isolated until the disease ran its course. This was a radical new approach, using empirical observation to develop effective preventive measures. By the 1460s, quarantine procedures had become routine across the European Mediterranean. Ports maintained plague hospitals, lazarettos, where suspected plague patients could be isolated. Ships flew yellow flags to indicate plague aboard. Health officials inspected vessels before allowing them to dock. Bills of health were introduced, requiring ships to document their ports of origin and any plague incidents during voyage. These measures represented the beginning of modern public health infrastructure, all born from the plague's lessons. Beyond quarantine, observant physicians noticed other patterns. They observed that the rich, who could afford to flee cities when plague struck and isolate themselves in country estates, survived at higher rates than the poor, crowded into urban slums. This suggested that avoiding contact with infected persons was protective, an obvious observation now, but revolutionary in a medical system that blamed disease on corrupted air or divine punishment. Some doctors began recommending that the wealthy barricade their households, admitting no visitors and having servants leave food outside doors to minimize contact. The plague also inspired some of the earliest attempts at systematic data collection for public health purposes. Some cities began keeping death registers, trying to track plague's progress and predict where it would strike next. These were primitive compared to modern epidemiology, but they represented a new way of thinking about disease as something that could be measured, tracked, and potentially controlled through rational intervention rather than prayer or magic. The Bills of Mortality in London, which began tracking weekly deaths in the 16th century, were direct descendants of record-keeping practices developed during plague years. Medical education began to change in response to plague's lessons. New universities were founded in the decades following the Black Death, partly because wealthy survivors left bequests to educational institutions, partly because plague had killed so many professors that teaching positions needed filling, and partly because the crisis created demand for better medical knowledge. These new institutions, while still teaching traditional authorities, increasingly emphasized practical observation and clinical experience. Students were expected to treat actual patients, not just study texts. Anatomy became more important, as doctors sought to understand how plague damaged the body. The shift toward empirical observation in medicine was part of a broader intellectual transformation. The plague had demonstrated that traditional authorities, both religious and secular, could be catastrophically wrong. This created space for questioning other received wisdom. Why should Aristotle's physics be accepted without question if Galen's medicine was wrong? Why trust ancient Greek astronomy if ancient Greek medicine failed? This skeptical attitude toward inherited authority, combined with increasing emphasis on direct observation and experiment, would eventually culminate in the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries. The plague doctor, with his distinctive bird-like mask filled with aromatic herbs, became an iconic figure during later plague outbreaks. These physicians, operating on the miasma theory that bad air spread disease, believed the herbs in their beaked masks would filter corrupted air and protect them. They were wrong about the mechanism. Plague isn't airborne except in its pneumonic form. But the masks did create a barrier that may have reduced contact transmission. More importantly, plague doctors represented a new professional class, specialists in epidemic disease who worked for city governments to treat the poor, document deaths, and implement public health measures. Some plague doctors began conducting primitive epidemiological investigations. They would try to trace the spread of plague through communities, identifying which houses were affected and in what order, looking for patterns that might reveal how the disease moved. These investigations were hampered by limited understanding of disease transmission and poor record-keeping, but they represented the beginning of epidemic investigation as a scientific discipline. The realization that disease followed patterns, that it could be studied and potentially predicted, was a crucial step toward modern public health. The connection between plague and the scientific revolution runs even deeper than medical advances. The demographic catastrophe created economic changes that fostered scientific thinking. With labor scarce and expensive, there was increased demand for labor-saving technologies. Watermills, windmills, and mechanical devices became more valuable. This created incentives for technical innovation and mechanical thinking. The printing press, invented in the mid-15th century, spread new ideas with unprecedented speed, including medical and scientific knowledge derived from plague observations. Wealthy survivors of the plague had money to invest in education, art, and intellectual pursuits. The founding of new universities and colleges, many endowed by plague survivors, created centers of learning and debate. These institutions, while ostensibly religious in character, provided spaces where scholars could question traditional authorities and develop new ideas. The proliferation of educational institutions, ironically funded by plague deaths and bequests, subtly undermined the unity of medieval Christianity by creating multiple centers of intellectual authority rather than a single church-controlled orthodoxy. The psychological impact of surviving a seemingly random catastrophe also changed how people thought about the world. Plague killed without apparent pattern or purpose, undermining the medieval sense that everything happened according to divine plan. This created space for thinking about natural phenomena as following their own rules, rather than being direct expressions of God's will. If plague could be studied, understood, and potentially controlled through human action rather than divine intervention, perhaps other aspects of nature could too. This naturalistic approach to understanding the world was essential for the development of modern science. Doctors who had questioned Galen during the plague years created precedent for questioning other ancient authorities. Natural philosophers began testing Aristotle's claims through observation and experiment, rather than accepting them on authority. The universities founded or expanded after the plague became centers where this new empirical approach could flourish. While the full scientific revolution wouldn't occur for another 2 centuries, The seeds were planted in the plague years, when traditional authority collapsed and observation-based thinking began to take its place. The most dramatic and immediate transformation the Black Death wrought was economic. Within months of the plague's arrival, the fundamental relationship between labor and capital was turned upside down. For centuries, European feudalism had been built on a simple reality. Peasants were abundant, and land was scarce. Lords owned the land, and peasants who wanted to farm it had no choice but to accept whatever terms the lord offered. Serfdom, a system where peasants were legally bound to the land and owed their lord labor services, a share of their harvest, and various fees, was the foundation of medieval economy. Peasants had almost no bargaining power. There were always more peasants than available land, so lords could pay subsistence wages and extract maximum rents. Then, half the population died, and everything changed. The labor shortage was immediate and catastrophic. Fields lay unharvested because there weren't enough workers to bring in crops. Landowners who had previously commanded dozens of laborers suddenly couldn't find anyone to work their estates. Peasants who survived discovered they had options their parents and grandparents never dreamed of. If your lord offered poor wages or harsh conditions, you could simply walk away and find another lord desperate enough to offer better terms. The traditional arrangement where peasants were bound to a single lord's land became unenforceable when lords were competing desperately for any workers they could find. Wages skyrocketed almost overnight. Records from England show that agricultural laborers' wages doubled or even tripled in the years immediately following the Black Death. A reaper who had earned 2 pence per day in 1347 could demand 5 or 6 pence in 1350. Skilled workers saw even more dramatic increases. Masons, carpenters, blacksmiths, and other craftsmen were scarce enough that they could essentially name their price. The chronicler Henry Knighton complained that workers were so above themselves and so bloody-minded that they took no notice of the king's command regarding wages. But if anyone wanted to hire them, he had to submit to their demands, for either his fruit and standing corn would be lost, or he had to pander to the workers' arrogance and pride. Landowners watched in horror as the economic world they'd always known inverted. They were now the supplicants, begging workers to labor for them. The power relationship that had defined medieval society for centuries reversed in a matter of months. Peasants who had previously groveled before their lords now made demands and expected them to be met. Some walked away from years of back debt or traditional obligations, knowing their labor was too valuable for lords to punish them. The threat of enforcement that had kept peasants in line, obey or we'll drive you off the land, became hollow when there were 3 lords competing for every available laborer. The response from the ruling class was predictable. They attempted to use law to reverse economic reality. In England, the Statute of Laborers was passed in 1351, decreeing that all wages must return to pre-plague levels and that workers could not leave their traditional lords to seek higher pay elsewhere. Similar legislation was enacted across Europe, in France, Spain, and the German territories. These laws attempted to freeze wages at 1346 levels and restrict worker mobility, essentially trying to rebuild feudalism by legislative fiat. It was an exercise in futility. You cannot repeal the law of supply and demand through parliamentary decree. The wage control laws failed spectacularly because landowners themselves were forced to violate them. If you strictly enforced the Statute of Laborers and paid only the legal maximum wage, your crops would rot in the fields, while your neighbor, who was quietly paying above the legal rate, got his harvest in. Faced with the choice between following the law and economic ruin, landowners chose survival. They paid the higher wages, they offered better terms, they competed for workers, just like their workers competed for the best positions. The laws remained on the books, but were honored mostly in the breach. This massive transfer of wealth and power from lords to laborers created medieval Europe's first middle class. If this economic revolution is blowing your mind, hit that subscribe button and drop a like. Comment below. Would you have stayed loyal to your lord or sold your labor to the highest bidder? Your engagement helps us bring more forgotten history to life. Beyond just higher wages, workers began accumulating property and capital for the first time. With incomes double or triple what they'd been before plague, and with land prices falling because there was more land than people to work it, ordinary laborers could save money and buy property. The wage-to-rent ratio shifted dramatically in favor of workers. A peasant who had once needed a year's wages to rent a single acre could now rent several acres for the same price. Some workers accumulated enough to buy land outright, becoming small landholders themselves rather than tenants. This accumulation of property by ordinary workers created genuine social mobility for the first time in medieval European history. The son of a serf could become a landholder. The grandson of a peasant could become a merchant. These transformations had been theoretically possible before the plague, but practically impossible. There simply wasn't enough excess wealth flowing to the lower classes to enable significant accumulation. After the plague, with workers commanding high wages and land cheap, the rigid stratification of medieval society began to blur. Not everyone rose, of course, but enough did that social mobility became a realistic aspiration rather than a fantasy. The improvement in living standards for ordinary workers was dramatic and measurable. Real wages adjusted for the cost of living, increased substantially. Workers could afford better food, better clothing, and better housing. Meat consumption increased among the lower classes. Diets that had been based almost entirely on bread and porridge now included cheese, eggs, and occasional meat. Workers built larger houses with more rooms and better construction. They bought furniture, cookware, and textiles that would have been impossible luxuries before the plague. For the survivors, the post-plague decades brought a higher standard of living than their ancestors had enjoyed for generations. This improvement in ordinary people's lives was one of history's great ironies. Mass death led to better living conditions for survivors. The Black Death functioned as what economist Thomas Piketty might call a great leveler, a catastrophic event that dramatically reduced wealth inequality. Before the plague, wealth was concentrated in the hands of landowners who extracted maximum value from abundant peasant labor. After the plague, with labor scarce and valuable, income flowed to workers instead of landlords. The return on capital and land ownership plummeted, while the return on labor skyrocketed. Economic historians have documented this shift in meticulous detail by analyzing wage and price data from the medieval period. In England, real wages for unskilled building laborers increased by approximately 40 to 50% in the decades following the Black Death and remained elevated for over a century. Similar patterns appear in data from northern Italy, Spain, and other regions with good records. The workers' share of total economic output increased substantially, while landlords' and capital owners' shares decreased. This wasn't wealth redistribution through taxation or policy. It was the market brutally adjusting to new demographic realities. The nobility and wealthy merchant class watched this economic leveling with alarm and attempted various strategies to maintain social distinctions as financial distinctions blurred. One response was sumptuary laws, legislation dictating what different social classes could wear, eat, or display. If a peasant could now afford silk and velvet, laws were passed declaring that only nobles could wear these materials. If workers could afford meat daily, laws restricted certain foods to upper classes. These laws were as ineffective as wage controls. How do you stop someone from buying and wearing expensive clothes when they have the money to do so? Another response was cultural. The nobility made their fashions deliberately more extravagant and expensive to maintain visible social separation. If rich peasants could afford simple silk, nobles would wear silk embroidered with gold thread and studded with jewels. If workers built two-room houses, nobles built mansions with dozens of rooms. The conspicuous consumption and elaborate fashion of the late medieval and early Renaissance period was partly driven by the upper class's need to visually distinguish themselves from newly wealthy commoners. Fashion became more extreme, more expensive, and more elaborate precisely because economic barriers between classes were eroding. The long-term economic impact of the Black Death was even more profound than the immediate wage increases. The labor shortage encouraged technological innovation and capital investment in labor-saving devices. Why pay expensive workers to grind grain by hand when you could build a watermill? Why employ numerous shepherds when you could switch from labor-intensive grain farming to less labor-intensive sheep raising? The decades after the plague saw increased investment in mills, mechanical devices, and agricultural innovations designed to reduce labor requirements. This technological shift was particularly notable in England, where landowners responded to high wages by converting arable land to pasture for sheep. Sheep required far fewer workers than grain farming. One shepherd could manage hundreds of sheep, whereas grain required numerous workers for plowing, sowing, weeding, and harvesting. The English wool trade expanded dramatically in the post-plague period, with wool exports becoming a major source of national wealth. This agricultural shift from grain to wool was a direct result of the changed labor economics created by plague. It would have lasting consequences, eventually contributing to the enclosure movement that transformed English agriculture. The labor shortage also affected the structure of craft production and guild organization. Before the plague, guilds had been able to maintain tight control over who could practice trades, limiting the number of masters and keeping journeymen in subordinate positions. After the plague, with skilled workers scarce, guild control weakened. Workers could demand to be made masters sooner, or could simply leave restrictive guilds and practice independently. Some guilds loosened their requirements to attract members. Others saw their monopolies eroded as desperate customers turned to non-guild workers who could actually deliver services. Urban areas saw particularly dramatic economic changes. Cities had always been centers of commerce and craft production, but they'd been constrained by limited purchasing power among the masses. After the plague, with higher wages in workers' pockets, urban markets expanded. There was more demand for manufactured goods, more money for luxury items, and more trade in general. Cities that had been stagnant before plague grew rapidly afterward, as workers migrated to urban centers where wages were highest. This urbanization trend would accelerate over the following centuries, eventually creating the urban-dominated economy of early modern Europe. The financial sector was also transformed. Before the plague, most ordinary people dealt entirely in barter or small coin transactions. Banking and credit were for merchants and nobles. After the plague, with workers accumulating savings and making larger purchases like land, there was increased demand for financial services at all social levels. Money lending, savings institutions, and basic banking services expanded to serve a broader customer base. This financial deepening helped facilitate further economic development and capital accumulation. However, the economic changes weren't uniformly positive. The immediate post-plague years saw severe disruption to trade networks and production. The breakdown of markets, the death of skilled workers, and the interruption of supply chains caused short-term economic contraction. Some industries collapsed entirely because critical skilled workers died and their knowledge died with them. Certain luxury goods that required rare skills became unavailable. Some trade routes ceased functioning because there weren't enough merchants or sailors to maintain them. The economy had to rebuild from massive disruption. Price inflation in the immediate plague years was severe. With production disrupted, but survivors having money to spend, prices for available goods skyrocketed. A chicken that cost 3 pence before plague might cost 10 pence after. Not because chickens were scarce, but because there were fewer people raising chickens, and those who did could charge premium prices. This inflation was partly why wages had to increase so dramatically. Workers needed higher nominal wages just to maintain purchasing power. Eventually, prices stabilized as production adjusted to the new demographic reality, but the transition period was economically chaotic. The plague's economic impact varied significantly by region, creating divergent development paths that would shape European history for centuries. This divergence was most stark between Western and Eastern Europe, which responded to the same demographic shock in opposite ways. In Western Europe, particularly in England, France, and the Low Countries, the labor shortage led to higher wages, the erosion of serfdom, and increased economic freedom for workers. In Eastern Europe, especially in lands east of the Elbe River, the response was the opposite: the reimposition of serfdom in harsher form, restriction of labor mobility, and increased exploitation of peasants. The divergence came down to political structures and the relative power of different social classes before the plague struck. Western Europe in the 14th century was politically fragmented, with power divided between kings, nobles, cities, and the church. No single authority could impose its will uniformly. Cities had charters granting them autonomy and self-government. The nobility was divided into competing factions. This fragmentation meant that when the plague created labor scarcity, workers could play competing authorities against each other. If one lord refused to pay higher wages, workers could move to a city that offered better terms. If a city's guild became too restrictive, workers could relocate to a more welcoming jurisdiction. Eastern Europe's political landscape was different. In the German territories east of the Elbe, in Poland, Hungary, and Russia, political power was more consolidated in the hands of large landowners who worked together to control the peasantry. These regions were also less urbanized, with fewer cities that could serve as alternative destinations for fleeing peasants. When the plague hit, Eastern European nobility responded collectively to prevent peasants from exploiting labor scarcity. They passed laws binding peasants more tightly to the land, restricting movement, and increasing labor obligations. These laws were actually enforced because the nobility controlled enough power to make them stick. The result was what historians call the Second Serfdom, a reimposition and intensification of feudal obligations in Eastern Europe precisely when they were collapsing in the West. Peasants in Prussia, Poland, and Russia found themselves with fewer rights and heavier burdens after the plague than before it. They were legally prohibited from leaving their lords' estates. Their labor obligations increased. They had essentially no legal recourse against abusive lords. While Western European peasants were demanding and receiving higher wages, Eastern European peasants were being forced back into conditions approaching slavery. Economic data confirms this divergence. In Western European cities, construction activity and manufacturing expanded in the post-plague decades as cities secured greater autonomy and used their wealth to build impressive public works. In Eastern European cities, construction and manufacturing dropped by approximately 1/3 relative to pre-plague trends and compared to Western cities. The economic dynamism that characterized late medieval Western Europe was largely absent in the East. Cities that might have developed into major commercial centers instead stagnated under noble-dominated political systems that restricted trade and manufacturing to protect agricultural interests. The Black Death split Europe into two different worlds, one moving toward capitalism and freedom, the other toward oppression and stagnation. If you're fascinated by how one pandemic changed the course of history, smash that subscribe button and leave a like. Drop a comment. Why do you think the responses were so different? Let's discuss the role of politics in economic development. This east-west divergence persisted for centuries and helps explain different development paths that ultimately led to Western Europe industrializing in the 18th and 19th centuries, while Eastern Europe remained predominantly agricultural. The Black Death activated underlying political differences and pushed regions onto divergent trajectories. Had the plague never occurred, or had it affected both regions similarly, European development might have followed a more uniform path. Instead, the pandemic became a critical juncture that amplified small initial differences into major, long-term divergences. The divergence extended beyond economics into political culture and institutions. Western European cities that gained autonomy after the plague developed traditions of self-government, citizen participation, and limited governmental authority. Guilds and merchants had voices in city councils. Property rights were relatively secure. Legal systems developed that protected individuals against arbitrary authority. These institutions and cultural patterns would eventually support the development of more democratic and capitalist systems. Eastern European regions that went the opposite direction developed political cultures of strong central authority, limited individual rights, and state domination of economic activity, patterns that would persist into the modern era. The agricultural sector showed the divergence most clearly. Western Europe shifted toward more market-oriented farming, with peasants producing for sale rather than mere subsistence. Land became a commodity that could be bought and sold relatively freely. Agricultural improvements and innovations spread as farmers sought competitive advantage. Eastern Europe moved toward large estate agriculture worked by enserfed labor, with lords extracting maximum output through coercion rather than market incentives. Agricultural productivity in the East stagnated, while Western productivity slowly improved, creating an economic gap that widened over time. Even within Western Europe, the plague's impact varied by region, creating smaller-scale divergences. The Low Countries, modern Belgium and Netherlands, with their strong cities and weak nobility, saw particularly dramatic gains in urban autonomy and economic freedom. Italy's city-states, already powerful before plague, became even more dominant in the post-plague period, creating the economic foundation for the Renaissance. England's relatively strong monarchy was able to maintain more order than fragmented France, leading to different trajectories in state formation. These regional variations, all ultimately stemming from how different political systems responded to plague-induced labor scarcity, shaped the different paths European nations would follow into the modern era. The Black Death's role as a catalyst for long-term institutional change cannot be overstated. Economic historians now recognize it as one of the key factors explaining why Europe, or more specifically Western Europe, developed differently from other world regions. China, India, and the Islamic world all experienced plague outbreaks during the same period, but they didn't see the same institutional transformations. The combination of Europe's specific pre-plague political fragmentation and the plague's demographic shock created unique conditions for institutional change that set Western Europe on a path toward eventual global dominance. Beyond institutional and economic changes, the Black Death left a biological legacy that continues to shape human populations today. Recent genetic research has revealed that the plague served as a brutal form of natural selection, favoring certain genetic variants that provided protection against Yersinia pestis, while eliminating others. The survivors of the Black Death weren't just lucky. Some of them were genetically resistant to plague. They then passed these protective genes to their descendants, leaving a genetic signature that can still be detected in modern European populations. The most dramatic example of plague-related genetic selection involves familial Mediterranean fever, FMF, a hereditary inflammatory disorder caused by mutations in the MEFV gene. People who carry 2 copies of FMF mutations suffer from a debilitating disease characterized by recurrent fevers and inflammation. However, and this is crucial, people who carry just 1 copy of the mutation, heterozygotes, appear to have enhanced immunity to Yersinia pestis. The FMF mutation triggers inflammatory responses that can help fight off plague bacteria without causing the full-blown disease. This creates what geneticists call a balanced polymorphism, a situation where a gene variant that's harmful in double dose is beneficial in single dose, allowing it to persist in populations at higher frequencies than would otherwise be expected. The FMF mutation is particularly common in populations around the Mediterranean and Middle East, exactly the regions that experienced repeated plague outbreaks over millennia. The genetic evidence suggests that plague epidemics, including but not limited to the Black Death, selected for FMF mutations by killing people who lacked them while allowing carriers to survive and reproduce. Research teams have identified other genetic variants that also appear to have been selected by plague. Certain variations in genes related to immune function, particularly those involved in recognizing bacterial pathogens and triggering inflammatory responses, show signs of having increased in frequency in European populations after the Black Death. The plague was so deadly and so widespread that it exerted measurable evolutionary pressure on human populations, favoring genes that provided even modest protection against the disease. The family-level survival patterns documented in plague burial sites support this genetic story. When archaeologists found that if a mother survived plague, her children tended to survive too, they were potentially observing genetic resistance in action. A mother with plague-protective gene variants would pass them to her children, increasing their survival chances. The same genes that helped her survive would help them survive. Over multiple plague outbreaks across centuries, families with these protective variants would have higher survival and reproduction rates than families without them. This genetic legacy means that modern Europeans and people of European descent carry, in their very DNA, the mark of the Black Death. The disease didn't just kill millions, it reshaped the human genome in affected populations. When scientists sequence modern European genomes, they're seeing, in part, the result of plague-driven natural selection. Genes that helped survive medieval pandemics are now part of our standard genetic inheritance, passed down through 30 generations from plague survivors to their distant descendants. The implications extend beyond historical interest. Understanding which genes provided plague resistance could help develop treatments for modern bacterial infections. The immune pathways that fought off Yersinia pestis might also be relevant for fighting other bacterial pathogens. Medical researchers studying the genetics of plague survival aren't just doing historical research. They're potentially identifying targets for new antibiotics or immunotherapies. The Black Death, in this sense, conducted a massive, unintentional experiment in human genetics that modern medicine can learn from. Beyond specific gene variants, the Black Death may have contributed to broader patterns of immune system evolution in European populations. Populations that experienced repeated plague outbreaks over centuries would have been under constant selective pressure for robust immune function. This might explain some of the immune differences between populations with long plague histories and those without. Of course, other factors like different pathogen exposures also shaped immune evolution. But plague was likely a significant factor given its severity and the duration over which it affected Europe. The genetic legacy also raises profound questions about disease, evolution, and population history. How many other historical pandemics have left similar genetic signatures? Did the plague of Justinian in the 6th century also select for resistant genes? What about other major killers like smallpox, measles, or typhus? The Black Death is unique in how well it's been studied genetically, but it was hardly the only disease shaping human evolution. Every major pandemic potentially altered the genetic composition of surviving populations, making modern humans, in a sense, the product of millennia of disease-driven selection. The study of plague genetics also highlights how disease and human history are inseparably intertwined. We often think of history as political events, wars, and great leaders. But pandemics like the Black Death were just as important in shaping the modern world. They killed millions, transformed economies and societies, and even altered human genetics. Understanding this biological dimension of history provides a richer, more complete picture of how we became who we are today. The genes in our cells carry memories of historical catastrophes, written in DNA rather than parchment. Yet, despite all the death, all the social transformation, all the genetic selection, the story of the Black Death didn't end in the 14th century. The disease that killed so many never actually went away. It persisted in wild rodent populations across Asia and other regions, periodically erupting into new outbreaks. Europe continued to experience plague epidemics for another 4 centuries after the initial Black Death outbreak. These later waves never matched the mortality of 1347 to 1353, partly because population density was lower, and partly because some degree of genetic resistance had been selected for. But they remained devastating. Plague returned to major European cities repeatedly through the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. The Great Plague of London in 1665 to 1666 killed approximately 100,000 people, about a quarter of the city's population. Vienna lost a similar number in 1679. Marseille suffered a major outbreak in 1720. Moscow recorded over 100,000 deaths in 1770 to 1771. These weren't isolated incidents, but part of a pattern of recurring epidemics that continued to shape European life for generations. The plague became endemic, a recurring nightmare that could strike any city in any year, keeping populations in constant low-level fear. The disease finally disappeared from Europe in the early 19th century for reasons that remain somewhat mysterious. Improved public health measures, particularly quarantine and isolation of the sick, likely played a role. The replacement of the black rat, Rattus rattus, with the brown rat, Rattus norvegicus, in European cities might have been a factor. Brown rats are less likely to live in close proximity to humans and may be less effective plague vectors. Changes in housing construction, with fewer thatched roofs and more separation between living spaces and grain storage, reduced rodent contact with humans. But no single explanation fully accounts for plague's disappearance. It simply faded away. A terror that had haunted Europe for 400 years, vanishing almost as mysteriously as it had arrived. Want to know the terrifying truth? The plague never really left. Subscribe now for the shocking conclusion, and hit that like button if this history is keeping you on the edge of your seat. Comment below. Did you know plague still exists today? Share your thoughts. But while the plague disappeared from Europe, it never disappeared globally. The disease remains endemic in rodent populations across multiple continents, particularly in Central Asia, parts of Africa, and the western United States. The same Yersinia pestis that caused the Black Death still circulates in wild animals, waiting for the right conditions to jump to humans. Between 2010 and 2015, there were 3,248 documented human plague cases worldwide, resulting in 584 deaths. These aren't isolated historical curiosities. They're ongoing reminders that the disease hasn't been eradicated. Madagascar is particularly hard hit, experiencing regular plague outbreaks even in the 21st century. In 2017, An outbreak of both bubonic and pneumonic plague in Madagascar affected over 2,400 people and killed more than 200. The disease spread to the capital city, Antananarivo, creating scenes eerily reminiscent of medieval plague outbreaks. People fleeing cities, authorities setting up quarantine zones, hospitals overwhelmed with sick patients. Modern medicine saved many who would have died in earlier centuries, but the disease itself was unchanged. The same black buboes, the same pneumonic symptoms, the same rapid progression to death without treatment. The United States sees an average of 7 plague cases per year, mostly in rural areas of the Southwest. Northern New Mexico, northern Arizona, southern Colorado, California, southern Oregon, and western Nevada all have endemic plague in prairie dog and ground squirrel populations. Hikers, campers, and rural residents occasionally contract plague from flea bites or contact with infected animals. Most survive because antibiotics are effective if administered quickly, but deaths still occur. In 2015, a teenager in Colorado died of plague contracted from flea bites. The medieval killer still claims victims in the modern world. Public health officials worry about several scenarios involving plague's return. First, antibiotic resistance is an increasing concern. While plague is currently treatable with common antibiotics like streptomycin, gentamicin, and doxycycline, bacteria can evolve resistance. If antibiotic-resistant strains of Yersinia pestis emerged and spread, modern medicine would be nearly as helpless as medieval doctors. Some antibiotic-resistant plague cases have already been documented, though not yet widely spread. The nightmare scenario is a plague outbreak with bacteria resistant to all available antibiotics. Second, climate change is bringing humans into closer contact with plague reservoirs. As temperatures rise and precipitation patterns shift, the geographic range of rodent species that carry plague is expanding. Development is pushing into previously wild areas, increasing human contact with infected animal populations. Rising temperatures may allow plague-carrying fleas to survive in regions where they previously couldn't, expanding the disease's potential range. Models suggest that climate change could make plague outbreaks more frequent and occur in new geographic areas. Third, there's the specter of bioterrorism. Yersinia pestis has been studied by multiple nations as a potential biological weapon. The Soviet Union develops techniques for weaponizing plague, creating antibiotic-resistant strains and engineering them for aerosol release. These weapons programs supposedly ended with the Soviet collapse, but the knowledge and techniques remain. The pneumonic form of plague, which spreads through the air and kills rapidly, would be particularly devastating if deliberately released in a crowded city. Biodefense experts consider plague one of the more dangerous potential bioweapon agents. Modern surveillance and response capabilities are far better than anything medieval societies possessed. We can sequence plague bacteria within hours, track outbreaks in real time, deploy antibiotics rapidly, and isolate infected individuals effectively. International health organizations monitor plague cases globally and can coordinate responses across borders. These capabilities mean that a modern plague outbreak, while dangerous, is unlikely to reach the catastrophic scale of the Black Death. We're not helpless as our ancestors were. Nevertheless, the continued existence of plague serves as a reminder that infectious diseases remain fundamental threats to human societies. We haven't conquered disease through modern medicine, we've only gained tools to fight it more effectively. Those tools can fail. Antibiotics can become useless through resistance. Public health systems can be overwhelmed. Social and political breakdown can prevent effective response. The COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated that even with modern medicine and global communication, a novel infectious disease can still kill millions and disrupt societies worldwide. The Black Death's lessons remain relevant precisely because the underlying dynamics haven't changed. Humans remain vulnerable to infectious diseases. Pandemics can emerge suddenly and spread globally through trade and travel networks. Social and economic structures can collapse under disease pressure. Scapegoating and persecution can emerge during crises. But also, human societies can adapt, innovate, and recover. The medieval world survived the Black Death and ultimately built new institutions and practices from the ruins. Modern societies facing pandemic threats can draw on both the warning and the hope embedded in that history. The genetic legacy of plague resistance, the institutional changes it triggered, the economic transformations it caused, the scientific thinking it inspired, all these continue to shape the modern world. We are, in a very real sense, living in the world the Black Death made. The disease killed tens of millions, but from that catastrophe came changes that ultimately contributed to the creation of modern Europe and, through Europe's global expansion, shaped the entire world. It's a dark irony that one of history's greatest disasters was also one of its most transformative events. When we look back at the Black Death from the vantage point of the 21st century, we see both a historical catastrophe and a turning point that helped create the modern world. The plague destroyed the medieval social order, but in doing so, it created space for new institutions, new ideas, and new social arrangements that would eventually lead to the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, and the emergence of modern capitalism. None of these developments were inevitable, and all came at a terrible cost, but they were at least partly enabled by the breakdown of old structures that the plague caused. The story of the Black Death is ultimately a story about human resilience and adaptation. Faced with incomprehensible catastrophe, medieval societies didn't simply collapse. They survived, adapted, and ultimately transformed themselves. The changes weren't always positive, and the suffering was immense. But humanity persisted. That persistence, that ability to endure and rebuild even after losing half the population, speaks to something fundamental about human societies. We can survive almost anything, even if the world that emerges from survival looks radically different from the world that entered the crisis. As we face our own pandemic challenges in the modern era, the Black Death offers both warning and reassurance. Warning: infectious diseases can kill on scales that devastate entire civilizations. The death toll, the social disruption, the economic collapse can be total and overwhelming. But also reassurance. Societies can survive even the worst pandemics. They can adapt their institutions, develop new knowledge, and build better systems from the ruins. The medieval world that entered the Black Death was gone forever by 1353, but the world that emerged was in many ways more dynamic, more innovative, and more capable than what came before. From the greatest catastrophe came unexpected transformation. The Black Death reminds us that history isn't just the story of human action, but also of human reaction to forces beyond our control. Bacteria smaller than the eye can see reshaped continents. Climate fluctuations in Central Asia triggered waves of death across Europe. Random genetic variations determined who lived and who died. Yet within these constraints, human choices mattered. How societies responded to the plague, whether they scapegoated minorities or protected them, whether they clung to failed authorities or embraced new ideas, whether they tried to freeze wages or allowed markets to adjust. These choices shaped outcomes and created divergent paths that persist centuries later. In the end, the Black Death is a story about contingency and consequence, about how small differences in initial conditions or responses can compound into vastly different outcomes. It's about how catastrophe can be a crucible for transformation, and it's about how the past never really dies. It lives on in our institutions, our genes, our ideas, and in the diseases that still threaten us. The plague that arrived in Kaffa in 1347 on Mongol catapults set in motion changes that rippled across centuries and continents, ultimately helping to create the world we inhabit today. That world still contains the plague, still faces pandemic threats, and still must grapple with the lessons learned at such terrible cost so many centuries ago. The Black Death is not just history. It's a warning, a lesson, and a reminder that the relationship between humans and disease is far from over.